Hey AgEcon, welcome to the last portion of Unit 3, focusing on trade barriers. So yesterday we spent some time chatting a little bit about what trade is and comparative and absolute advantage and why countries choose to trade and some of the pacts and agreements that are in place between different countries for trading different goods. But today we're going to talk a little bit about what makes trade challenging and the barriers to trade, why some countries choose to not participate in trade, some of those different barriers that are in place, if you will, okay? So before we get there, we're going to do a little bit of a review, blast from the past from yesterday, as we review some concepts of comparative and absolute advantage, and then we will put our thinking caps on and learn some new information as we talk about trade barriers. So buckle up, it's going to be a good time today. All right, so as always, we'll start with our learning target. So first, we'll be able to recall concepts from comparative and absolute advantage that we touched on yesterday. Then we'll describe what a trade barrier is in our own words. And finally, we'll be able to compare and contrast the different forms of trade barriers that exist. Okay, so as promised, it's important to review, right? We learned a lot of stuff yesterday about trade, and it's important for us to actually put that in practice a little bit. So what we're going to do here is I have a couple of questions for us. There's 7 in total, and 5 of them are up on the screen right now for you. What you're going to do after I explain these directions is hit pause, grab a scratch sheet of paper out or a Google Doc or something, and try to answer these questions, okay? So over on the right, we have the amount of sweaters and waffles, it's making me kind of hungry, produced in 1 hour in the United States, so here, and in Belgium, okay? I want you to look at that chart and tell me who has the absolute advantage in producing sweaters, and who has the absolute advantage with producing waffles, okay? Then on the flip side, comparative advantage, who has the comparative advantage in sweaters and who has comparative advantage in waffles. And then finally, suppose the US is looking to trade with Belgium, okay? What should the US specialize in choosing to trade, okay? So these are the first 5 questions, then the other 2 will come next in the graphing problems, okay? So go ahead, hit pause, and we'll see how you did. All right, so now that you've had an opportunity to answer these questions on your own, let's see how you did. If you struggle with this or you thought it was a little bit challenging or maybe you weren't able to come up with all the answers on your own the first time, this is an opportunity for you to reflect and say, maybe I should go back to yesterday's presentation and do some more for practice, okay? So here are the answers. So remember, absolute advantage and comparative advantage are pretty similar yet different, okay? Absolute advantage, we're simply going to look at which country or which region is producing the absolute most of that within the specific time frame, okay? Comparative advantage, we're going to have to crunch some numbers and figure out the ratio to see what we are giving up versus what we are receiving, okay? So absolute advantage, there's no math really necessary. You just got to compare some numbers, okay? So absolute advantage in sweaters, if we look at the data table, we see that the US produces 10 sweaters in 1 hour, and Belgium only produces 4 sweaters in an hour, okay? So now that we know that the US has the absolute advantage in producing sweaters simply because they're producing 10 sweaters in 1 hour instead of Belgium's 4. Okay. On the flip side, the absolute advantage in waffles, the US produces 40 waffles in an hour, and the country of Belgium produces 48. Okay. So if we know that, then we're able to know that Belgium has the absolute advantage in waffles because they're producing more. Okay. Now this is where it gets a little bit tricky with comparative advantage. Who has the comparative advantage in sweaters? Okay. So to figure this out, we're going to have to do some math. We know that if the US is producing 10 sweaters and 40 waffles in an hour, that they're essentially giving up 4 waffles to produce 1 sweater, because we take 40 waffles divided by 10 sweaters, and that gives us 4. Okay. On the flip side, Belgium, they are producing 48 waffles in an hour and 4 sweaters in an hour. Okay, so that's going to tell us that the US has the comparative advantage in sweaters. They are going to be giving up less resources to make sweaters, okay? On the other hand, if we do that math again, Belgium is going to have the comparative advantage in waffles, okay? So again, if we take 4 divided by 48 and 10 divided by 40, we are having a smaller number for Belgium, okay? So they have a lower opportunity cost, therefore they have a comparative advantage in producing the waffles, okay? Now, suppose the US is looking to trade with Belgium. The US should certainly specialize in making sweaters. Okay, this is essentially because we are producing more sweaters efficiently than Belgium. And I mean, practically, we're producing the same amount of waffles. I mean, we're producing 8 less here in the US than Belgium in an hour, but we're producing over twice as many sweaters. So the US should truly specialize in making sweaters and trade those out versus the waffles, okay? So now I want you to go back and think about how to draw a production possibilities curve or production possibilities frontier. I want you to draw the current US curve based off of the data. So remember here on this chart, we have the amount produced in 1 hour. So you're going to have to probably multiply everything by 10 as you construct your production possibilities frontier. So we did this yesterday, but go ahead, hit pause, and then we'll see how you did. All right, so hopefully you had a chance to do that. Hopefully you created a nice, well-constructed graph that's properly labeled, just like mine. Okay, so we have 400 waffles produced at the top and 100 sweaters produced at the bottom. And it's going to be a downward sloping line, okay, similar to a demand line, as we remember from supply and demand. Okay, so we know that if we are producing and investing all of our resources to produce waffles, we could produce 400 waffles, but we're not going to produce any sweatshirts, okay? This is our production possibilities frontier. Now, for the next question, we want to consider trade. So now the US has decided to trade with Belgium at a rate of 2 sweaters for 11 waffles. What is the US's consumption possibility frontier now with this information? Okay, so we talked about this yesterday. Go ahead, hit pause, and we'll see how you did. All right, so your graph should look something like this. So your production possibilities frontier, I kept that on there just so we can kind of see the shift that occurred. But remember, we are producing, or we are giving up 2 sweaters and gaining 11 waffles, okay? So our production possibilities is down here, but because we are importing or gaining 11 waffles, our consumption possibility is higher, okay? So production possibility lower, consumption possibility is higher because we are importing more than we are exporting. We are only exporting 2 sweaters and we are gaining 11 waffles, okay? Notice too how these lines start to get a little bit closer and closer together. That's because as we produce or as we trade more sweaters, we are going to be getting more waffles because we're trading more sweaters, we're getting more waffles in return. And as we decide to trade fewer and fewer sweaters, that means we're going to get fewer and fewer waffles in return. Okay. So hopefully this kind of makes some sense. This is all should be reviewed from yesterday. If this is confusing you or you don't remember this, maybe go back to yesterday's presentation to get a little refresher or work on some practice problems. Okay. So now this last part of the class is pretty self-explanatory. We're just going to talk a little bit about the barriers to trade, what makes it challenging. No math here, so congratulations, you made it through all of the math for this class, which is good. So this is more like a concept of what makes trade challenging for some countries. So trade barriers can be broadly defined as the restrictions or limitations that are associated with trade. Okay. Many countries decide to place limits on trade for a variety of reasons, and some of these include tariffs, quotas, embargoes, licensing requirements, standards, and subsidies. And we'll talk a little bit about each of these today, and then we'll be done. Okay. So with these barriers, one of the most common ones that you probably have heard of in history class or just in the news is a tariff. A tariff is a type of tax that's placed on goods that we are importing from a different country. Okay, so the overall effect or goal is to raise the price of the imported product. This helps our domestic products of similar products to sell them at a higher prices, and it also allows money that is received from the tariff to be collected by the domestic government. So I found a nice little diagram on the internet that explains this pretty well. So let's say in Britain, we have cloth that is produced at $4 a roll. Okay, so in Britain, I could go into a supermarket or a market and purchase a roll of cloth for $4. Now, if that was shipped over to the US, this thing called a tariff adds 25% or $1 in this case to the price. So in the US, I could go into Walmart or whatever store I choose to go to and purchase that same British-made cloth for $5. So we're paying more simply because we're importing it from a different country. Now, in America, we might find that exact same or very similarly constructed or composed roll of cloth for $4. So some people might lean towards purchasing products that are produced within the United States or in-house before they go and purchase things that were made abroad. Now, tariffs aren't imposed on every single good that's imported abroad, and sometimes it fluctuates throughout history how much tariff is charged, but this is just kind of a good starting point, okay? Next, we have quota. Quota is something that we probably have all heard of at some point. If you're in the FFA world, we know that each regional competition, we can only send a certain number of teams to state in each contest. So for parliamentary procedure, we might only be able to send 2 teams to the state competition one year, and then the next year maybe it's 3. That's called a quota, the maximum number of people that we can send. Here, a quota is a limit on the amount of goods that can be imported to a country. So this generally creates a shortage, which causes the price of the good to rise, right? Because we know that if there's shortage, the goods are going to be scarce. Therefore, people are going to be more willing and able, not necessarily able, but more willing to pay a higher price generally because it's a luxury or not as common good. Okay. On the other side of things, an embargo is what stops exports or imports of a product or group of products to or from another country. And there's generally a lot of political background here that happens when an embargo occurs, and you could go back in history. There were many historic embargoes that occurred with oil in the past. So it's an important thing to know about an embargo. Sometimes all trade with a country is stopped. And this is usually, again, for political reasons. So I'd encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about embargoes, go ahead and Google. I probably should have been a good teacher and came with some examples, but the oil embargo is the most historic one that I personally have read and learned about. Okay. Now, just like we need a license to drive a car, or for me, like teach a class, you need a license to import or export a good. Okay. Imports can be restricted by not issuing many licenses, and export licenses have been used to restrict trade with certain countries or to keep domestic prices on agricultural products from rising. So licenses are generally another hoop you got to jump through in order to import or export, and the government or issuing agencies can restrict the amount of licenses they issue over time. Okay? Standards are the laws or regulations that nations use to restrict imports. So there's a certain benchmark or like the definition standard that needs to be in place. And if that standard is not met or exceeded, the country could simply say, we're not going to import that or we're not going to export that. So this helps establish health and safety standards for imported goods. Okay, and it's the major form of trade restriction, and it's used in many different amounts by many different countries. So standards are generally the biggest barrier to trade, or the most common one that we see, because countries can be picky as to what they're going to choose to import or not import. Okay. And lastly, we have subsidies. And subsidies is a big word that we hear in the agricultural world, especially in today's farm economy. Subsidies are when the government gives dollars to domestic producers to encourage production. Okay? This can be good, and it can be used to pay production costs. So it can encourage producers to actually go ahead and continue producing even during challenging times. This results in lower costs and lower prices for the overall product, and it can charge less for their goods than foreign producers. Subsidies are paid for by taxpayers who may or may not use the good. Okay, so subsidies are generally pretty controversial, especially in today's economy. But they are another tool that we can use to stimulate economics, and also it is a barrier to trade for some countries. So it's good to know a little bit about that as well. So hopefully those different barriers all kind of made some sense. They're pretty self-explanatory tools that we can be utilizing in the market to encourage or discourage trade. But a lot of these different barriers actually, like I said, discourage or make trade a little bit more difficult. So hopefully, as a result of today's presentation, you can recall concepts from comparative and absolute advantage. You can describe what a trade barrier is in your own words. Remember, those trade barriers prohibit or make it more challenging to trade from country to country. And lastly, you can compare and contrast the different forms of trade barriers, whether that be a subsidy, whether that be an embargo, whether that be a tariff. So we talked a little bit about each of those today. So hopefully this all makes sense, and if not, feel free to send us an email. We'll be happy to discuss or go a little bit more in depth. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.